Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Lettings Triad Podcast. Today we're tackling a question that's becoming increasingly relevant in the modern rental market. And that question is, are traditional rental bonds out of date? For a long time, the answer would have been a very clear no. Deposits were simply part of renting. You found a property, you paid your rent, you handed over the deposit, and that was that. But the rental landscape has changed significantly over the last decade. Rents have increased, competition of properties have intensified, and tenants are under more financial pressure than ever before. And to cater for that market, we've seen alternate products emerge. Bond replacements, zero deposit schemes, one of those being a company I'm familiar with called Flatfair, which promise to reduce upfront costs for tenants whilst potentially offering landlords a different kind of protection. And you could argue a better level of protection. But we'll cross that in a bit. So today in this episode we're going to explore whether the traditional bond still makes sense, where its limitations are, and why alternative options are gaining ground. Okay, let's start with the basics, understanding the traditional rental bond. Now, I'm going to say probably 90+% of you are aware of and use, both landlord and tenant, a traditional rental bond. Now, a traditional rental bond, also known as a security deposit, easy for me to say, is usually capped at 5 weeks' rent, although there is currently no cap in Wales. If you are across the bridge in England, you would be aware of the 5-week cap. Now, the idea behind the bond is straightforward. The tenants pay a lump sum at the start of the tenancy, which is held throughout the term and used to cover things like unpaid rent, damage beyond fair wear and tear, or breaches of the tenancy agreement. At the end of the tenancy, assuming that the property is returned in good condition and there are no rental arrears, the tenant gets that money back. From an historical perspective, this system makes sense. It creates accountability, it gives landlords a level of financial reassurance, and it encourages tenants to look after the property. After all, they have got a large sum of money invested in that property in a bond. For many landlords, the traditional bond still feels like the safest and most familiar option. It's tangible money, it's regulated, and it's something they've relied on for years. Now, for tenants, there's also comfort in knowing that, at least in theory, the money is refundable. If you do everything right, you should get it back. But theory and reality don't always align. So let's look at the growing pressure of upfront costs. One of the biggest issues with traditional bonds today is the upfront financial burden they place on you, the tenant. So let's have a look at this scenario. Imagine a property renting at £1,000 per month, and you took a bond, or you requested a bond of £1,100. On moving day, the tenant will be expected to pay the deposit plus the first month's rent. That's £2,100 before you've even collected the keys. This is obviously aimed at the tenant. So before you've even collected the keys, you would need to find £2,100. Now, add in moving costs, furniture, appliances if they are not there, council tax, utilities, internet, and in general expenses of setting up a new home. Suddenly, the cost of moving becomes a serious barrier. For some tenants, that deposit money has been saved over months or sometimes even years. But for many others, particularly renters moving frequently, relocating for work, or dealing with unexpected life changes, that lump sum can be difficult to produce. And this is where the traditional bond starts to feel less like protection and more like an obstacle. Let's look at the next section, which is limitations of the traditional bond for you, the landlord. Interestingly, the traditional bond doesn't just have drawbacks for tenants, it also has limitations for you, the landlord. 5 weeks' rent might sound substantial in real terms, but it doesn't always go very far. If a tenant falls into serious arrears or causes significant damage to the property at the end of the tenancy, that deposit can be exhausted very quickly. On top of that, deposit disputes can be time-consuming and stressful. Even when landlords feel they have a clear claim, the process of recovering funds isn't always straightforward, especially if you have to go to arbitration, which is what takes the time. So, while traditional bonds feel safe and familiar because we've always used them, including myself, they don't necessarily offer competitive protection, or comprehensive protection even, especially in higher risk scenarios. So, enter bond alternatives or zero deposit options. Over the past few years, we've seen a growing number of alternatives enter the market. These include zero deposit schemes and bond replacement products such as Flatfair, which I mentioned earlier. Rather than paying a large refundable deposit, the tenant pays a smaller, non-refundable fee at the start of the tenancy. This fee effectively replaces the traditional bond. So just think about that for a second and we'll have a look at this example. So let's look at the example earlier when talking about the tenant saving money on move-in. For example, if the rent is £1,000 and the bond was a traditional bond of £1,100, that is £2,100 upfront. Now, with products such as Flatfair as an alternative, the upfront cost would be around £336 for the bond alternative. That, of course, puts the overall move-in at £1,336. That's a saving of around £764 at move-in. Now, it's crucial to be transparent here. The £336 is non-refundable. At the end of the tenancy, the tenant doesn't get that back. And for some people, that alone makes the scheme a non-starter. Just to make it clear, that £336 is per property and not per person. So if there's 2 tenants moving in, that's £168 each, which all of a sudden makes it look quite attractive. But for others, that trade-off is entirely acceptable. So why bond alternatives appeal to tenants? Well, for tenants, the biggest appeal is simple: cash flow. Reducing moving costs by several £100s or more can make a huge difference. That saved money might go towards furnishing the property, paying off existing debts, for example, or covering childcare costs, or simply providing a financial buffer. In some cases, it can be the difference between being able to move at all and being stuck where you are. These schemes can also level the playing field in competitive rental markets. When multiple tenants are applying for the same property, having lower upfront costs can allow someone to act quickly without stretching themselves financially. It's also worth noting that not all tenants are focused on getting a deposit back at the end of the tenancy. Some tenants prioritise affordability today over a potential refund in the future, especially if they expect to move again within a relatively short time frame. So we've discussed the tenant. What about the landlord, and what protection does it offer? This is where the conversation becomes more nuanced. While tenants are benefiting from lower upfront costs, landlords are often offered a different form of protection through these schemes. In many cases, the cover available can exceed the value of a traditional 5-week deposit. Just listen to that again. In many cases, the cover available can exceed the value of a traditional 5-week deposit. Instead of being capped, landlords may have access to broader protection against rent arrears, damage, or other tenancy breaches. Claims processes are often structured differently, sometimes making them quicker and more predictable. In effect, these products shift the risk model. Rather than relying solely on a lump sum held in a deposit scheme, landlords are backed by an alternative financial mechanism designed to respond to issues as they arise. For some landlords, this feels like progress. For others, it feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity often breeds caution. So, take Flatfair for example. This is the one that I'm actually affair with and I've used in the past. They offer up to 10 weeks worth of protection for landlords. This is split into 10 weeks for damages, etc., or 5 weeks arrears and 5 weeks damages. So let's see what this means in numbers. So you've taken a traditional bond, which is based on the rent of £1,000, £1,100. Rent arrears deducted because at the end of the tenancy the tenant didn't pay the last month's rent is £1,000. So that leaves you with £100 for cleaning or damages. So it's a high risk if you really think about it. If that 1 month's rent is not paid on the last month, you've got £100 to play with. Of course, that is using sort of an arbitration or a mediation, and that could be slightly different if you went to small claims court, for example. Okay. Now, just think of the bond alternative going back to the 10 weeks or up to 10 weeks worth of cover. The cover provided would be around £2,307. So, in the same example, the tenants failed to pay the last month's rent. Take away that £1,000 arrears, that still leaves £1,307 for cleaning and damages. There is a complete marked difference between the two. Which one you choose still depends on you, and you should seek independent legal advice when making a decision. I'm just giving you the examples, which of course could change depending on the rent, and if you did go to court and not use arbitration through TDS, DPS, or My Deposit, for example. The question of choice and suitability. Are traditional rental bonds out of date? Well, the honest answer is no. But they are no longer the only viable option. Traditional bonds still suit many tenants, particularly those who are financially comfortable, planning to stay long term, and keen to recover their deposit at the end of the tenancy. They also suit landlords who prefer simplicity and familiarity. At the same time, bond alternatives and zero deposit schemes clearly have a place. They offer flexibility, accessibility, and a different approach to risk. For tenants under financial pressure, they can remove a significant barrier to renting, and for landlords, they can offer enhanced and more structured protection. The key is transparency and informed choice. Tenants need to understand that non-refundable fees are exactly that. Landlords need to understand how protection works and what it is or isn't, and what it does and doesn't cover. So, as the rental market continues to evolve, it's likely we'll see a mix of traditional and alternative approaches coexist. What matters most is that both landlords and tenants have options that suit their circumstances. Traditional bonds aren't obsolete, but they are no longer the default solution for everyone. In a market where flexibility is increasingly important, that might be a very good thing. Until next time, cheerio.